So I think language is absolutely important to the ways that we build intentional communities. And oftentimes, again, people see language as a neutral space, and it's not. One of the really valuable things that I bring into my women's studies classroom, for instance, is thinking about the gendered nature of the English language and even Spanish or other languages that don't have gender neutral pronouns, for instance, that don't have a word that represents anything outside of the binary between male and female or men and women. And the struggles for people who then don't have the language to define themselves in their native tongue. I think language is also really powerful when we think about how we name and define other phenomenon. I think one of the things that disturbs me is this idea of digital natives or digital immigrants as this term to reflect, people who are growing up in the 21st century, who have been born into the iPod age, who are 2 and know how to unlock an iPad, right? These really amazing skills that kids have these days because they're immersed in a digital landscape, have been named digital natives. And I think that that's a problematic use of language, especially because it's so rooted in this history of creating an understanding of citizenship as belonging to a space. And I think if we look at the history of the United States, it's very clear that citizenship has always been a protected category that few people had access to at the beginning. That the notion of citizenship has obviously expanded over the course of our nation's history, but we still live in a context in which even those of us who are citizens are perpetual outsiders, right? So if we look at Mexican American or Latinos in the United States, or Asian American people, I would say, we're constantly asked, where are you from, right? We can be 5 or 6 generations in this nation, and people will say, but where are you from, right? And the from, I think, is really interesting. I think that becomes a very important code for those of us who are asked that question a lot, when we don't present ourselves as looking like we're from here. So language can obviously become that very powerful tool of liberation in the form of storytelling, or oppression in the form of how language can be very narrow in who gets to be a part of it. I think the job of feminist academics has always been to challenge that narrative, to challenge how we understand terms and who gets to define those terms, and on whose backs are we building those definitions of those terms. And I think, thinking about language in that way can become very powerful, because you recognize that it's not this neutral thing, that words matter, that words hurt, that they have a legacy of historical trauma associated with them, or pain, or oppression. And so how do we build a world in which we can actively confront the way language might be used in a hurtful way, but also protect the freedom of speech, right? Which is another value that our nation is built upon. I think language is also really important for identity. As a Mexican American, when people find out where I'm from, the second question people typically ask is, do you speak Spanish? And that question might seem innocuous for people who ask it, often white people. But I find it to be a very offensive question because of the legacy and history of the way that Spanish has been criminalized in this nation's past, and because it's a site of pain for a lot of Latinos who are not native Spanish speakers. So I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, around Spanish speakers. My mother is the youngest daughter of she has 3 older sisters and 2 younger brothers, so the youngest daughter of her family. When she was growing up, she didn't need to speak Spanish because her sister spoke Spanish to her, or English to her, I'm sorry. And so my grandmother only speaks Spanish primarily, but I have an academic knowledge of Spanish. I can converse with her, but I don't have a fluency of this language. And so when people ask me, can you speak Spanish? It feels very much about that language will create a sense of authenticity. Like you will pass some kind of test if you have access to that language. Whereas we don't really ask that same question of other groups in this nation, right? And so for me, language becomes a very personal aspect of my identity that I constantly grapple with, that I feel upset that I don't have access to, that I feel jealous of other people who are not Latinos who speak better Spanish than I do. And I think that could really be minimized by a more broad history of the ways that language has been the site of trauma for so many communities of color in this nation, that shouldn't just be seen as like, a conversational topic for people to get to know you. And I know that there is that struggle when you're trying to get to know someone, but typically this is when I meet people on the street, right? And they're just chatting with me at the bus stop, for instance, or if I meet someone for the first time who sees my last name as Falcón and starts to ask me about that, right? So language is powerful, but I think it's also, again, the responsibility of other people to be aware of those histories, to Google something, right? We have search engines for people to do some of that research ahead of time so that we don't have to constantly be the ones who are always in that same position of educating others about why that might be a painful question.
Did you want to talk at all about the values piece?
Sure, yes. So this kind of switches us into civic, what's the word? Civic engagement. Civic engagement and, yes, it is, absolutely. Civic engagement, political advocacy, being an engaged member of your community is probably how I would define civic engagement. But again, that civic part can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I think shared values can become a site of initiating conversation and building relationships with people who might have different perspectives than yourself. As I mentioned before, I would be very hard-pressed to find any community in our state that would say they're against some of these core values that structure our notion of ourselves in this nation, like, having a hard work ethic, I would say, is something that really defines a lot of Minnesotan values, or having a perspective that is about taking care of your community, right? Of being, valuing your sense of home, and that means maybe taking care of the environment. It means creating structures to care for those who have less than you. Really, these structures that have been in place for quite some time. And I think that those values can become that entry point where people might be able to share some commonality with people who might have other differences with them. I think we see this a lot for people who take part in religious organizations, right? You might have a very diverse congregation, but they're tied together because of those core religious values that might be expounded or taught from the institution itself. And so I think in this increasingly partisan, seemingly partisan world that we live in, I think that becomes ever more important to think about, where do we have some shared values, and how do we get to those values might be where we differ in terms of being in our communities, but those values can become a part of opening that conversation up and allowing for that openness, and hopefully inspiring some people to perhaps see things differently, right? Oftentimes, we hear so much about how we live in a more partisan world than we ever have, or more partisan nation, and Other people, there's all kinds of people who say, well, it's not quite true. It maybe is true. Who knows what it really is. But I do think that there are opportunities for us to come together despite maybe having ideological differences, that there have to be shared values of being neighbors with one another, of sharing humanity with one another in ways that we can approach dialogues, conversations that are about how do we all work together in this community, and how can we achieve the goals that we all hold in a way that support more than just our own perspective.